Although the 2005 version of Resident Evil 4 is regarded as the best in the series, seemingly by a majority, I don't think it's the best Resident Evil game. Now, let me explain before everyone hates me for saying this. I think Resident Evil 4 is a good game that has inspired many other third-person action-adventure games and pioneered a successful genre. I'd think higher of the game if I didn't like survival horror and earlier Resident Evil games as much. Honestly, if I grew up with Resident Evil 4, I could have regarded it higher, and it may have been a classic game for me. What I want to say is that Resident Evil 4, although a great game in a vacuum, is not a great representation of the Resident Evil series. Resident Evil 4's reception and direction also led the series down a questionable path with Resident Evil 5 and 6. However, it is a Resident Evil game through and through, but I feel, at least, that it somewhat lacks major criteria that are present in all, if not a majority, of every mainline Resident Evil game. Now, stick with me here, because the rest of the video is subjective and a little bit arbitrary. I'm going to try to be as objective as I can in this video, although I feel the topic is pretty subjective. Again, to clarify, Resident Evil 4 is not a bad game, it just, in a somewhat arbitrary way, does not fit the mold of the series. I have played all of the mainline numbered Resident Evil games, excluding the original 1, 2, and 3. Not having played the original version of Resident Evil 2, and especially 3, may invalidate some of my opinions, but I will again try to be as objective as possible given the topic. While I mention Resident Evil 2 and 3, I will likely be relating to the original due to their similar gameplay from the original Resident Evil 1 and somewhat 0. On that note, I've also played Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil Revelations. I will not be talking about content past the main story of any of these games. I won't even be talking about professional mode in Resident Evil 4, as I haven't started that playthrough yet. I know that professional difficulty makes the game have stronger survival horror elements, but it's unlocked after already beating the main story. I should also clarify that I've only played extra modes in Resident Evil Revelations, Resident Evil 2 Remastered, Resident Evil 5, the story DLCs, and Resident Evil 7. I have only played about 10 minutes of Mercenaries mode in Resident Evil 6 for an achievement, but other than that, I have not played Mercenaries at all in the series. This is all just to clarify because I can, but not because I'll be talking about anything past the main campaign of RE4, save one mode that directly covers one of these criteria that make up an RE game. One more thing before I get into all of the criteria. I know it's been a while, but I want to be as clear as possible making this video and establishing context. All of these criteria that I'll be referencing for the series have been present in multiple mainline titles. A lot, if not all of these criteria, are present in the original Resident Evil and its 2002 remake. These criteria tend to overlap the survival horror genre and Resident Evil's themes it has stuck with, abandoned, and revisited throughout the releases of the series. So there are 3 major criteria, each of which contains various sub-criteria which will each have a rating based on their importance to the series. A less significant criteria will have 2 points, and a more significant criteria may have up to 5, for example. The 3 major criteria will be used to keep the list in order and have flow, but will not individually have points. I'll just combine their totals in the end of the video. There will be 50 points divided as I see fit throughout each major criteria, 20 points in gameplay, and 15 in both layout and theme. If you want to, you can skip to the timestamps titled How RE4 Compares, go ahead. But this is just to establish why I chose these criteria as reasonable criteria. And without further ado, here are the criteria and their respective qualifiers and reasoning. The main 3 criteria are gameplay, layout, and theme. Most of the sub-criteria for gameplay will mostly reflect survival horror as a whole. These criteria are as follows: inventory management, limited ammo and items, risk evaluation for skipping or killing enemies, somewhat clunky feel, the power and ease of use with weapons, aka is there a machine gun, and if so, do you get that at a time where it makes sense, and lastly, I'll be looking at RE4's enemy variety. Everything in the whole inventory management sphere and ammo spending risk evaluation is a staple of Resident Evil 0 through 3. The clunky feel is fairly subjective, but in my opinion, Every Resident Evil released before 7 is clunky in some way that arguably helps the horror atmosphere. It's up for debate if the clunkiness ruins the experience for these games, but that's something for another video. Most survival horror games limit the player from being too overpowered. Machine guns don't really belong in survival horror because they can take away from some horror by removing threats too easily from the game. Earlier Resident Evil games had fully auto rifles, but beating the game was required to access them. These weapons will, in most cases, be limited in ammo and will be awarded at a time that feels right. Resident Evil is known for its enemy and boss variety, as well as some of the entry's tyrant systems. Moving on to the criteria of layout. Although a lesser criteria, as it doesn't directly impact the experience of the game, like gameplay, and doesn't affect how the game fits in this series in concept, like theme, layout is still integral to the Resident Evil series. Layout's criteria are as follows: atmosphere, non-linearity, exploration focus, and puzzle-like progression. Resident Evil is a series with horror roots, and having a solid atmosphere is important for horror. Environments in gaming are significant for player immersion and retention. Most Resident Evil games have environments and layouts that are non-linear to an extent. This applies to Resident Evil 0 through 2 and 7 in a fairly accurate sense. Resident Evil 3 and Village are laid out in a similar way, but I'll get more in depth in the next sections. All of the prettiest numbered titles have some sort of hub area that the player needs to navigate around and discover items to move along in the game. This layout in Resident Evil games is a defining criteria of my enjoyment of these games and is fairly important to me. I really like the feel of Resident Evil being inspired by escape rooms, where the player needs to explore to progress. When gaining access to new areas, new items are unlocked to progress the game forward. Obviously, this can deter people away from replayability, but to me, this puzzle-like feel to Resident Evil games strongly resonates with me. Lastly, the criteria for theme. After all, you can't have a Resident Evil game if it's not in the Resident Evil universe. Theme can be divided into story themes and gameplay themes. Its story themes are story direction and allegory, as well as campy humor and dialogue, while its gameplay themes can be briefly described as multiple characters and earning the RPG. All Resident Evil games are one for one in the subcriteria of story/allegory itself. Each entry in the series has an allegory for industries and power being bad in the wrong hands. Each story has Umbrella, Neo Umbrella, Tricell, cults, or the government involved in some way, shape, or form. If we look less at exclusively story-related themes, there are recurring elements in most mainline games. The same applies to campy horror tropes and stupid dialogue lines. Resident Evil, despite its bleak theme and allegory, has some, whether intentional or not, dumb dialogue. One thing that I noticed while playing through the series was that having multiple playable characters or a co-op partner in some form reoccurred way too often not to be on this list. Every mainline Resident Evil game will let the player play as or with at least two characters. Resident Evil 1, 2, and 6 have different stories. Resident Evil 0, 3, 4, 7, and Village all have sections that require the player to switch characters, and Resident Evil 5 and 6 have an optional co-op story. Similar to the earlier point of machine guns being on flavor in horror games, plenty of Resident Evil games give the player an overpowered weapon in the end to reward them for their hard work. Many people call this earning the RPG, and it's a fairly common theme in most mainline Resident Evil games and how they end. Now that that whole ordeal is done with, how does Resident Evil 4 actually compare to these criteria? Well, starting off with gameplay, Resident Evil 4 loses some points due to its dramatic shift from what the series had established. In short, this can be described as simply the series going from its survival horror roots to a more action-adventure type gameplay style. Inventory management in RE4 is significantly changed from the series' roots. Previous entries utilize inventory management systems with a small inventory and item boxes scattered throughout the map. Resident Evil 0 is an interesting case where you can leave key items, weapons, and ammo on the floor instead of in item boxes. Resident Evil 5 and 6 have the most generic inventory management of the series, and I will not elaborate any further. Resident Evil 4 and Village both use the weapon case system, where the player keeps all consumable items and weapons on their character at all times. Key items do not take up storage, and therefore reduce time wasted from going back and forth on the map to get necessary items. In previous titles with a smaller inventory, players would lose time leaving behind key items for more inventory space. This system is really good for player retention, as inventory management is less of a concern. Backtracking can be annoying to players, especially when they don't know the layout of a map very well. Having key items not take up space saves a lot of time and stress to players who just want to progress the game. Resident Evil 4's inventory and merchant system is a good system, but it strays away from the roots of the series. I can't give inventory management a bad score, because the developers tried something different that still stays somewhat true to the inventory management in the series, especially when Resident Evil 4 is known for its inventory. I'm giving inventory management 2 out of 3 points. Ammo limitation is a key factor in survival horror, but Resident Evil 4 seems to fall short with how generous its ammo drops are. When I replayed the game for footage, I noticed that I never ran out of ammo. I did run out of ammo on some weapons, but I never really found myself begging to find ammo, as I could just switch to a weapon with more bullets. Near the end of the game, I did find myself in an ammo shortage, but this was only brought on by me not killing every enemy. As soon as I started skipping enemies and just sped through the story, I noticed I was losing some ammo. At some point, I had to shoot some enemies or bosses to get through an area easier. The problem with Resident Evil 4's ammo system is that you can be punished for skipping enemies. Enemies reward ammo when killed often. They also have the chance to give money, or nothing instead. In areas where I had to kill a bunch of enemies, I realized that I never really lost ammo. Most of the time, it even seemed like I netted positive ammo from fights. One thing I enjoyed a lot from Resident Evil 0 through 3, and somewhat 7, was the fear of running out of ammo entirely. Resident Evil 4 is way too generous with ammo in a way that just feels wrong. I'm giving ammo limitation 0 out of 3 points. Ammo spending risk evaluation goes hand in hand with ammo limitation. Resident Evil games before 4 and after 6 have encouraged the player to save ammo by avoiding enemies. This ammo can be saved to pump a boss later when the player finds one. Resident Evil 4 starts to remove this risk analysis to skip enemies and replaces it with the risk analysis of skipping enemies. When you kill an enemy in Resident Evil 4, you are usually rewarded for it. If you get ammo, it's usually an amount that keeps you afloat. If you get money, well, that's almost as good as ammo because you can save that money for a weapon upgrade later. This upgrade can save ammo by increasing damage or mag size of the weapon. New weapon cases and even new weapons can also be bought at certain intervals. I'll get into that later though. Since ammo spending risk evaluation still exists in the game, but is simply inverted, I'm going to give it 1 out of 3 points. Resident Evil 4 does check the box of clunky feel. I don't know how much of this is on purpose, or if it's just a factor of time with the game being made in the early 2000s. Shooting in Resident Evil 4 rewards the player when they don't just fire right away. Each weapon has a decent amount of sway, which can be difficult to pilot directly after aiming down sights, so the player is rewarded for patiently aiming down sights and then shooting afterwards instead of immediately going to shoot. Resident Evil 4 also has tank controls, albeit they are far easier to adapt to than the earlier Resident Evil's tank controls. Although not in the moment-to-moment gameplay, menu and inventory navigation can be a little bit clunky. Resident Evil 4 is still playable for casual players, so I'm giving it a 1 out of 2 for its clunky feel. Resident Evil 4 does have easy weapons. You get access to a fully automatic submachine gun, the TMP, fairly early in the game. Unlike other Resident Evil games, weapons aren't found or unlocked, only bought at the merchant. This means that if you want to skip a weapon to save inventory space, you won't miss out on that weapon, so until you have enough space in your inventory, money, or ammo, you will never need to free up slots to gain access to a new weapon. There's no puzzle solving to unlock a shotgun, and there's no cupboard to open to find a magnum. Even if you tried to, you could not fully skip a weapon. Accessing weapons in Resident Evil 4 is unrewarding other than strictly the fact that you are getting a new weapon. With there being no discovery of weapons within the map itself, players can find themselves following a path that the game has set beforehand. Every so often, the player will encounter a new ammo type, which is a sign that the merchant will offer a new weapon soon. Not one that the player has missed before, but a weapon that is now all of a sudden for sale. These weapons are spaced evenly throughout the story, and the SMG is buyable early on. Although it's a weaker gun, it still gets easy kills with little effort, as expected from a fully auto weapon. The means of acquiring easy-to-use weapons and the timing of getting these weapons is very anti-Resident Evil, so I'll be giving Resident Evil 4 1 out of 4 points for this category. I wouldn't be talking about Resident Evil if I didn't talk about the enemies, bosses, and tyrant-like enemies. Resident Evil 4 does not fall short with its enemy or boss variety. The game features a varying amount of enemies, including humanoid zombies, some with weapons and shields, parasite zombies, flying bug things, that annoying minigun dude, and last but not least, regenerators also exist. The bosses in Resident Evil 4 are big guys, usually with big eyes in typical Resident Evil fashion. Resident Evil 4 does not include a roaming tyrant-like enemy, as the game just rewards killing zombies. Having an unkillable dude running around also wouldn't really fit Resident Evil 4, given how ammo is just provided at all times. That being said, I'm giving Resident Evil 4 4 out of 5 points for enemy and boss variety. As a recap, in terms of gameplay, Resident Evil 4 misses some points due to its departure from its survival horror roots. Resident Evil 4 scores 10 out of 20 points in the gameplay section of what makes Resident Evil games. If you're still watching, thanks for bearing with me. I spent a lot of time on this analysis and wanting to figure out why Resident Evil 4 doesn't resonate with me as a game in the series. As you've seen so far, my opinions on gameplay are fairly biased against Resident Evil 4. This will not change in the next section layout. That being said, we're gonna start off strong here. Resident Evil 4 has a great atmosphere. For a game this old, Resident Evil 4 pushed boundaries with the design of its areas and atmosphere. Despite its yellowish color palette in the early game, the game's various areas immerse the player in the world. Each separate area throughout the story has a different feel and different story that the location tells, especially the island. Although I never played the game as a wee lad, I've heard that the regenerators in the endgame gave people nightmares when they were younger. I mean, I can see why. Their design is creepy after all. The castle section, where you play as Ashley, although fairly short-lived, shows how immersive the atmosphere is as well, especially when the assumed empty armors just attack you out of nowhere. I have to give RE4 3 out of 3 points for atmosphere. However, my praises are going to stop for a while, as Resident Evil 4 does not really fit into the same realm as the early Resident Evils do in regards to linearity. That is to say, Resident Evil 4 is way too linear. Every mainline title other than 5 and 6 have some sort of hub area that incentivizes backtracking and exploring an area. Resident Evil 3 has a lot of areas that aren't interconnected, but most areas do require a somewhat non-linear approach. Resident Evil 0, 1, 2, and 7 all have one large map that the player explores for the majority of the game. Resident Evil Village has a hub area that is not as incentivized as earlier entries, but still establishes the setting well. Resident Evil 4 only has a couple of areas where you need to backtrack or explore. The village can sort of be seen as a hub area that you need to investigate, but honestly there's nothing keeping you there except money or ammo drops, and if anything, the village is only a minor portion of the game. The game is linear, and you'll rarely spend time in one area for an extended duration. You are always moving forward, it seems, and the story is your guide throughout most areas. Resident Evil 4 scores 1 out of 4 points in non-linearity. Similar to non-linearity in a lot of ways, Resident Evil 4 lacks an exploration focus. As I mentioned in the gameplay section, weapons are unlocked through the store and only appear after the player progresses far enough. You don't find weapons in the map, removing the obligation to explore the game. There's no point in staying in an area unless if you're trying to collect all of the yellow herbs or treasures. The only exception to this is the free Punisher pistol you can unlock if you shoot enough blue medallions in the village. Then again, you have to access that weapon from the merchant. Other Resident Evil games, again, not 5 and especially not 6, reward exploration. As you explore these maps further, you can find ammo, resources, weapons, lore, and key items. Backtracking and exploration are a big part of the Resident Evil series and its roots, despite how backtracking can just be seen as a way to lengthen the playtime of a game. It serves a purpose in Resident Evil games to guide the player through the map while making them feel like they are discovering the story and unraveling it themselves. Resident Evil 4 doesn't really have this, as there is little backtracking except for a couple short instances. Key items never really have to be explicitly acknowledged by the player. You just pick them up and plug them in where they belong. The game doesn't feel rewarding in regards to exploration. So I'm giving Resident Evil 4 1 out of 3 points in exploration focus. Puzzle-like progression is important to the core of Resident Evil games. This progression is not just describing if a game has puzzles, which thankfully Resident Evil 4 does have some, but it's more talking about how the game progresses. Let's just get puzzles in general out of the way. RE4 has some small puzzles, but honestly those puzzles are little time sinks that don't require too much thinking or general exploration. If you see a puzzle in Resident Evil 4, you may spend only a couple of attempts max getting it solved. It still has puzzles, but that's being generous. In terms of puzzle-like progression, it kind of disappoints. To elaborate, I see this progression similar to the methodology of solving escape rooms. To be honest, that's how Resident Evil as a series began. You're in a mansion, and you need to explore to find clues and items to escape. Resident Evil 4's setting, linearity, and layout don't really emphasize the escape room methodology. Finding a key isn't a process that requires discovery. Instead, it's a quest marker that's clearly established when you pull up the map. There's never really a moment where I got a key item and had to think of where it could go. The game had already told me, or I knew I never needed to worry about finding its correct place. I'm giving Resident Evil 4 2 out of 5 points in puzzle-like progression. As a recap, in terms of layout, Resident Evil 4 misses some points due to its departure from its survival horror roots. Resident Evil 4 scores 7 out of 15 points in the layout section of what makes Resident Evil games. Theme is the last major criteria that I'll be looking at for Resident Evil 4. Honestly, Resident Evil 4 is a pretty solid Resident Evil game when exclusively looking at the themes of the game itself. I'll be trying to cover this section without spoiling much. I will leave out everything that I can to still be able to communicate my thoughts. If you don't want to hear me talk about these points just in case, even though I'll somewhat be spoiling the bare minimum, skip ahead to the conclusion section. The story's theme and message are very Resident Evil-y. Trying to avoid spoiling the game, the theme of the story, like all Resident Evil games, revolves around organizations or people using viruses to gain power by some means. The allegory of Resident Evil games has always been something along the lines of power in the wrong hands is bad, science can be pushed too far, be careful who you can trust, and bad people will do whatever they can to gain power. I personally enjoyed the story, but it's nothing outstanding. Resident Evil never really does anything too extraordinary with its stories, at least in my opinion, but I still like them. In terms of Resident Evil 4 being on brand with the rest of the series, and in terms of story allegory and themes, it gets 5 out of 5 points. Resident Evil has always been a campy series. Resident Evil 1 had the itchy tasty note and the Jill sandwich line.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
While Resident Evil 5 had boulder punching, and Ethan's games have had some solid one-liners.
Welcome to the family, son.
Resident Evil 4 delivers on the campy side of things with its feel at times and some dialogue lines.
Your right hand comes off?
Leon is a silent protagonist in gameplay, but has some chuckle-worthy one-liners when he talks outside of the gameplay. I'm giving Resident Evil 4 3 out of 3 points for campiness.
I freed her!
Oh, no.
One of the least important criteria in this whole video is playable characters. Now, why is it on the list then? Well, because I wanted to put it out here, and I also just find it interesting how all of the mainline Resident Evil games have this. To clarify, this criteria is not referring to how the characters are written or anything, it's just looking at if the game allows you to play as other characters. Resident Evil 0 has a character switching system, Resident Evil 1, 2, and 6 have different stories for different characters selected. This varies from each title. Resident Evil 3, 4, 7, and Village all put the player in another character's shoes during the story, and lastly, Resident Evil 5 and 6 have co-op partners throughout the story. To elaborate on Resident Evil 4's system once more, it has you escort Ashley for a majority of the game. lets you play as Ashley in the mid to late game, and has a mode unlocked after you beat the story where you play as a familiar face while they are doing relevant things at the same time as Leon did in the main story. This DLC is important for context on the allegory side, so play it if you want lore and the full story experience of the game. That being said, I have to give Resident Evil 4 2 out of 2 points for its playable characters criteria. Approaching the final stretch of the video, we have the criteria for thematically earning the RPG. Now, earning the RPG is a crucial element of Resident Evil games and somewhat survival horror. The whole concept is based around the idea of, well, I've gotten this far, I can do anything. Or, let's end this nightmare once and for all. It's also a classic trope that's been used in horror movies for at least decades. Sometimes this trope can be overlapped with the final girl trope. Back to gaming though. This element is present in all Resident Evil games to an extent. Sometimes the RPG isn't an RPG at all. Sometimes it's just a heavier boss that goes down a little too easy. No matter how it's done, it does exist in all Resident Evil games. Resident Evil 4 does use an RPG to finish off the final boss and cue the final cutscene. This RPG is earned after damaging the boss for a while. My main gripe with the RPG in Resident Evil 4 is it doesn't feel as earned. With Resident Evil 4 being an action-adventure game where you mow through most enemies and even some bosses, it's hard to feel like you've earned an RPG. As you're progressing through Resident Evil 4, you never really feel like you're barely hanging on. You always have an advantage, assuming you're playing on normal that is, which you'd have to play on normal first to even be able to access professional mode. Also, you can even purchase RPGs from the merchant in the late game, just by reaching a certain point. It isn't earning the RPG if it's just given to you as an option to purchase in the store. You do literally earn an RPG in Resident Evil 4 to end the game, but it conceptually feels unearned or even just given away. For that, I have to give this criteria 3 out of 5 points. That brings the total points for theme to 13 out of 15 for Resident Evil 4. Honestly, the closest Resident Evil 4 comes to being a Resident Evil game is just in its themes. Its gameplay and layout are a huge departure from the series. To recap before my conclusion, I view the gameplay of Resident Evil 4 to be a decent bit Resident Evil-y. Its weakest criteria are on ammo management and preservation, while its strongest criteria are its variety in enemies. The layout of Resident Evil 4 doesn't fit Resident Evil in concept due to how anti-exploration and how strictly linear it is. However, the atmosphere really makes up for it. Resident Evil 4's theme and connection to the Resident Evil universe kind of carry this game above the 50% Resident Evil-y mark. A version of Resident Evil 4 that had more gameplay and structure in line with the original Resident Evils honestly would have been great as an individual game. Resident Evil 4 gets 30 out of 50 points for all these categories combined. That makes Resident Evil 4 60% of a true Resident Evil game. After replaying Resident Evil 4, making this analysis, and talking to my friends about my experience, I can say that personally, Resident Evil 4 is not a good Resident Evil game. It's a good game for sure, even if it's old. I mean, it did inspire so many solid games in the third-person action-adventure genre. It was truly a pioneer of the time. Resident Evil 4 has its place in gaming as a game that is super important to the direction of games. However, where Resident Evil 4 takes its throne in the Hall of Fame, it also brings some infamy. Resident Evil 4 serves as a departure from what Resident Evil started as. Now, this is mostly a good thing. Every game that takes inspiration from Resident Evil 4 would not exist in its current state if Resident Evil 4 was more survival horror. Third-person games may have been a lot different if Resident Evil 4 itself wasn't one. However, Resident Evil 4 was the last good Resident Evil game according to a decent portion of people, at least until Resident Evil 7 came out and reignited the series, taking inspiration from its roots and modern horror. Resident Evil 5 and 6, as I've hinted at numerous times in this video, were majorly different from anything released in the series beforehand. Resident Evil 4 was a stepping stone for this to happen, and for the next few entries, Resident Evil took a turn away from survival horror to fully commit to action horror and then action adventure with the Resident Evil story. This era of Resident Evil sold well and brought new gamers to the Resident Evil community, which led to new fans enjoying all of the games that the series had to offer. Resident Evil 4 is a perfect example of a silver lining. Despite the opinions of series purists, it was a great game for its time and expanded the RE fanbase. However, it was the start of a slippery slope away from the series' roots that took a long recovery. Resident Evil 4 does so much for gaming historically that I can't outright call it a bad game, despite what it did to exploration and the feel of the series. I personally don't enjoy the game much. I didn't have the most fun replaying the game for footage, as it felt like a chore, but I refuse to call it a bad game, and I stand by that. It's just a bad representation of the Resident Evil series. Finally, it's done. Now, after this outro, you can go back to whatever you were doing. First off, I want to thank you for watching all the way through the video. I know it was a long one, and I could have just said, Resident Evil 4 is not a survival horror game. It's just an action-adventure game that takes place in the Resident Evil universe, so it's not truly Resident Evil. But where's the fun in saying that? I wanted to go through everything that made me think that, and why I didn't really like the game, especially when it's regarded so highly. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Doing this stuff helps out in the algorithm, as does sharing the video. If you want to share the video with someone who has a strong opinion of Resident Evil 4, whichever side they take, I'd appreciate it. I'd also love to see your thoughts in the comments down below. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you all have a great day or night. See you in the next one.